In the wake of the United States and Russia's meeting in Riyadh and the comments made by President Trump afterwards, it is now totally unambiguous for all that a number of particularly European politicians will have to work through their denial and wishful thinking. That is that the United States has ended its role as an ally of Ukraine in the face of its invasion by Russia 3 years ago, and instead has become an adversary, aligned with Russia. This is the only real conclusion you can reach, looking at the outcome of the summit and what's been said about the process going forward. The spirit of that is not exactly unexpected. It's very much in line with the analysis I was giving of where we were just a couple of days ago. But the starkness of the realignment is certainly on the extreme edge of expectations. I've been saying since Greenland that Trump's actions now have to be judged as someone operating within a might makes right world order, and that is now pretty unescapably the case here. Details from those that took part in Riyadh, of course, are suitably ambiguous and mealy-mouthed. Marco Rubio described a three-part plan which was mostly about the United States and Russia. First, engaging with Russia about how to remove restrictions between themselves. Second, look at what an end to the Ukraine war would actually look like, with engagement with other partners, but, quote, ultimately, the Russian side will be indispensable to this effort. Thirdly, new partnerships between Russia and the US in geopolitics. I refer you to my video of last week. And in business. Extraordinary opportunities, he said, presumably trying not to salivate at the prospect. But what about that bit about, Ukraine? Senior correspondents from the Trump-friendly Fox News channel who were present in Riyadh said that a three-stage peace process had been discussed. First stage would be a ceasefire, locking in current territorial occupancy. Second stage, Ukraine required to hold elections. Third stage, then there can be a final deal. This vision is entirely consistent with what has been said by the various actors, specifically Donald Trump, in the 24 hours following the end of the summit. And it is very obviously a trap for Ukraine. A trap that has been designed by Russia and the United States, exploring the ways that the US can at least barely justify its delivery to Putin exactly what he wants. Should be self-evident how this trap works, but just for the Russian bots and the gullible, the ceasefire freezes the conflict in place on the current borders, thereby giving Russia the opportunity to rearm, to refresh, and be prepared for the resumption of fighting should that prove to be the preferred way forward. Russia has greater capacity to do that than Ukraine, so it is a relatively one-sided benefit. Forcing an election. First of all, many will hold it to be a grotesque sight, two great powers dictating when another country must hold an election, especially when one of those powers is Russia. I remind you that Trump himself had joked that Putin's supposed poll numbers in the last Russian election were so obviously ridiculous that Russia didn't have free or fair elections. So for Russia to be attacking Ukraine for Zelensky supposedly not being legitimate is just autocratic bullshit. Through history, even the most rapacious empire builders tended to put forward some bullshit excuse to justify them doing what they intended to do all along, blaming the other side for some inciting incident or some slight, imagined or real. This is in that category of statement. The assumption by Moscow is that Zelensky would lose such an election, and no doubt they will be doing their utmost to seek to secure exactly that result. And from their point of view, whatever that change looks like is going to be to their benefit. Either they succeed in planting a pro-Kremlin candidate who will negotiate a deal that will be a de facto surrender, but even if that doesn't happen, they'll have a new and relatively inexperienced leader who will be much more pliable and able to be pushed around. It is historically fairly common that democracies suspend elections during time of existential war, especially when it's your own country that's being invaded. Millions of Ukrainians have been displaced across the world. Significant chunks of Ukraine are currently under Russian control. Now, of course, no doubt, Russia would generously offer to facilitate the elections in those areas, and no doubt they would come back with, 98% support for whoever it was that Moscow had decided it supported? You would have to be naive or malevolent to argue for that as a process Ukraine would ever accept. And after all that, you then still have this big blank space where you have the final deal penciled in to magically appear, which means that this three-stage process isn't about peace between Russia and Ukraine. It's about preloading the dice against Ukraine in advance of opening the question. This disreputable plan was pretty clearly what then drove President Trump in remarks to the press afterwards, where he laid into President Zelensky. He repeated the Russian position that Ukraine was to blame for the start of the war. He repeated the Russian position that Zelensky wasn't legitimate and there should be elections. He repeated the Russian falsehood that Zelensky's support was down to 4%, which is wide of the mark. The most recent poll shows 57% support, but in any case is seeking to advance a Russian desire to undermine the leadership of their adversary. It could be that this initial US positioning is Trump's attempt to put more pressure on Zelensky to accept that one-sided wealth grab proposal we discussed yesterday. Sure, he's saying it would be preferable to you than what we're now cooking up with Vladimir Putin, wouldn't it? Russian media has been gloating at the outcome of the talks and has been very clear that this is indeed more important because of what it says about the alignment around a new multipolar world order. This is what they're seeing as the important aspect of the proposed summit between Putin and Trump to come. And they're right. TV presenter Dmitry Kiselyev said all things on which Trump is building his revolution, he, Putin, was talking about long before Trump. According to the independent Russian outlet Medusa, Kremlin strategists are keen to ensure that Putin is seen as being in the driving seat and not Trump. They don't want the image of weakness that would result if it seemed as though Putin failed where Trump succeeded. And the media is reportedly being instructed to, and in any case is clearly doing so, portraying Kiev and the Europeans as unimportant and weak and increasingly out of control of events. When it comes to the war, Russian media is clear that it will be decided bilaterally between Putin and Trump, and that everyone else should be seen as bit players. Oh, and of course that any settlement will be largely on Russian terms, which in their terms suggest that Ukraine won't get any of its territory back and Ukraine will never be allowed to join NATO. That last one may or may not be an issue because I'm not 100% sure what NATO even is right now. In the meantime, the European Union approved a new package of sanctions against Russia, banning Russian aluminium imports and imposing new export bans. It included new listings against Russia's shadow fleet vessels, which have been evading sanctions, delivering oil across the world, amongst other things. None of this much matters, given the blatant and obvious signs of widespread sanctions avoidance by routing goods through third-party countries. But it was nevertheless European leaders seeking to draw a contrast behind their continuing support for Ukraine and opposition to Russia and the realignment of the United States. And something of a riposte to US Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who had suggested that Europe would be brought to the table at some point in the future just because they have sanctions against Russia. In other words, they would be brought on to be told to drop those sanctions when the US felt that it had a deal. There is still plenty of denial in European capitals as to what's going on. For instance, French President Macron said that Trump could, quote, restart a useful dialogue with Vladimir Putin. Trump, he fantasized, was creating strategic ambiguity for President Putin by using very firm words and creating uncertainty that can help to exert pressure. Merde. Macron then emphasized that Washington's support was needed for future security guarantees to Ukraine. The memo clearly hasn't reached Paris just yet, but Washington is now on the other side. Literally, the US administration is engaged in a coordinated effort with Russia to undermine Ukraine's position. Any US promises as part of a security guarantee are worthless today. I mean, I wish it wasn't the case, but they just are. Trump already has shown contempt for honouring prior agreements, given his clear desire and stated intent to normalise relations with Vladimir Putin. Would you really, if you were Ukrainian, stake your future on any piece of paper that he was likely to sign? Now, that may already be catching up with Macron, as he hosted today the second emergency meeting of European leaders just this week. All of this obviously leaves Zelensky in a tricky place. He doesn't want to lambast Trump for his words, offensive as they will be to Ukrainians, because, purely pragmatically, there's always some hope that a change might occur. Trump is notoriously liable to sudden and dramatic shifts, and while it may seem less likely here, ripping into him makes it even less likely, and would give him perhaps even a vindictive revenge motive that could make things even worse. So Zelensky said this: unfortunately, President Trump, I have great respect for him as a leader of a nation that we have great respect for. The American people who always support us, unfortunately, lives in this disinformation space. Which is the nicest way possible of saying that he is talking total garbage dictated to him by Putin's own hand. Interestingly, when I reviewed the traditionally Trump-supporting news outlets in the US, I found remarkably low profile for the coverage of all this. I mean, yes, there are lots of things going on closer to home to talk about, but this would normally merit a lot of attention. It certainly did on the other side of the political spectrum media outlets. My ability to mind-read news editors is limited, but I wonder if there is a sense that while they aren't going to celebrate this as a great victory for Trumpism, they can't bring themselves to criticise either. So the answer is really just to stay relatively quiet. Well, except for the New York Post, generally a big Trump supporter. It ran an editorial titled, "Trump is asking for far too much payback from war-torn Ukraine." This was predominantly a response to the contract I discussed here yesterday, demanding half the country's revenues from natural resources in perpetuity, making the same point that I did, that this is the sort of demand that a victor places on the loser in a war. But also, it responded to Trump's later remarks, saying this: and the president's off-the-cuff remarks about Zelensky late Tuesday were wildly off base. You've been there for 3 years, you should have ended it, you should have never started it. He didn't start it, and he's had no chance to end it except by surrendering to the blood-soaked invader. Whatever negotiating tactics Trump cares to use, turning the truth completely upside down ought to be beneath him. And it went on in all the same terms that I previously discussed. This is the New York Post, remember, not to be confused with the New York Times. I guess they remember vaguely what it was like to be a Reaganite Republican or something. Anyway, good for them, because speaking so frankly in the modern American right is increasingly rare and I can imagine quite difficult. Others who are not positioned there, of course, have been able to speak more freely about the importance of what we've just seen. So, for example, Corey Shake of the American Enterprise Institute, former national security aide to President George W. Bush, said this: "It's a disgraceful reversal of 80 years of American foreign policy. Throughout the Cold War, the US refused to legitimate Soviet conquest of the Baltic states, and it gave heart to people fighting for their freedom. Now we're legitimating aggression to create spheres of influence. Every American president of the last 80 years would oppose President Trump's statement." So where does this leave us? My reading is that there is no part of this proposed deal that Ukraine or its European allies will accept. In that situation, I would expect Trump to then seek to apply pressure to them to get them to fall in line. What that looks like? Well, I'm guessing as far as Europe's concerned, tariffs will be involved somewhere, threats to remove troops entirely from Europe, pulling from NATO, all of those things. And the question will then be whether Europeans are actually ready to recognise the US has now become an adversary, or whether they fold, hoping that somehow that means they will be left alone, can pretend to still be an ally, while Trump refocuses his attentions on China. That I don't know, because most of the European leaders have been weak in recent years. And whether they rise to the challenge or show the downside of weak leadership, that, right now, is anybody's guess.